Hello, I'm Mike Manifold with the Williamsport Sun-Gazette, and we are grateful to have U.S. Senator Bob Casey join us today to answer voters' questions. Thank you for joining us, Senator Casey.
Sure.
Why do you believe inflation has been such a persistent problem the last several years?
Well, first and foremost, I think we have to recognize that in an inflationary economy, one of the drivers of that is our corporate profits. We saw from a Federal Reserve report just 2 years ago that not even 2 years ago, 2023, that corporate profits in the period July of 20 to July of 22 drove 41% of the inflation in the United States. So that doesn't mean that corporate profits drove all the inflation of those 2 years, but drove a lot of it. And that's one of the causes of inflation. That's why I made greedflation such a priority and issued a series of reports, several reports on greedflation itself more broadly, one specific report on shrinkflation, where the size of the package or the content of the product is shrinking, but the price is not shrinking. And then a separate report on junk fees, where major multinational corporations are ripping off families by hiding some of the fees that they're charging. The upfront price says one thing, and then when you add in the hidden fees on whether it's a hotel bill or a car rental, or so many other purchases or transactions that people engage in, including ATM fees, by the way, that cost you almost $5 to take money out of an ATM in the United States. So all these hidden fees, in addition to the broader issue of greedflation, and I've pointed it out so aggressively over more than 6 months now, more like 7 or 8 months, that I have a lot of big companies pretty mad at me right now. They're angry that I've exposed what they were doing, which is to take advantage of a pandemic and the post-pandemic period, take advantage of the challenges that were presented during that time, and jack up their prices way beyond their costs. No one would argue if costs are here for a company, a big company, and prices are used to offset it. That's the great American way. But when you take prices and you jack them up exponentially, and the proof is in that period I mentioned, July of 20 to July of 22, corporate profits in the United States were up 75%, 5 times the rate of inflation. So that driving of inflation by corporate profits was not just in that period. There's other reporting, other analyses that have been done that indicates that it continued into 2023. So I think pointing it out is important. Giving consumers the information they need to fight back is important. But I think over time, what's going to be important in terms of policy is to pass my price gouging bill, so the Federal Trade Commission would have the authority that a lot of attorneys general have to go after these companies, hold them accountable for price gouging if they're engaged in it, and an investigation would determine that one way or the other, either they're price gouging or they're not. But also at the same time, these same companies that have had record profits, sky high prices, it seems apparent to me that they don't need those big corporate tax breaks that were bestowed upon them in 2017 to the tune of about $2 trillion with a T, $2 trillion that jacked up our debt by that amount of money. So I think it's important we take action against greedflation, and I think that would help the American consumer a lot.
What role can the federal tax code play in providing Americans with relief from inflation and price increases? You mentioned a moment ago tax breaks in the 2017 legislation.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear to me, and I think pretty clear to most people who look at this, that over the last 40 years, certainly since the early 1980s, big corporations and very wealthy Americans have won almost every single battle on the tax code. And these are big battles. waged by hundreds and hundreds, and over time thousands of corporate lobbyists and lobbyists that are lobbying on behalf of powerful interests. The only time they lost in 40 years is when we passed the American Rescue Plan legislation, which didn't award a corporate tax break, but it did provide a big tax break for families raising children, where we took the child tax credit and we turbocharged it in ways that we should, I believe, should make permanent. The corporate or the child tax credit gave families in Pennsylvania more than $400 a month to help raise their children. Most of the families utilize that for food, using those extra dollars every month to pay for food for their family. Also, families used it for rent or to offset the cost of childcare, which is another huge cost in the life of a family. So tax policy can have a huge impact on giving families the resources they need to be able to afford prices that are caused by greedflation, and also to be able to afford other prices that are going up, whether it's the cost of childcare or energy or education or housing. So many costs in the life of families have gone up, and that we can utilize. We have a golden opportunity in 2025 to utilize the tax code to give families some relief, to give the middle class some relief, instead of doing what Washington has been doing for decade after decade, which is awarding the top, the wealthiest Americans and big corporations, awarding them all of the benefits. I'm just holding here something that I pointed out to my caucus today. It's, I don't know if you can see it, but it's an op-ed that was in the New York Times, and it's entitled, "What Kind of Country Do You Want? Start with Taxes." May the 30th, by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson. These are political science professors who are analyzing the opportunities we have in 2025 when the tax bill will be debated again. And here's what they say in pertinent part. A full extension, meaning taking the 2017, what I call a corporate giveaway, the 2017 bill, and extending that, a full extension of that. Here's what they say in the op-ed, quote, "A full extension would blow a $4.5 trillion hole in the budget during the decade between 2025, when the bill would be enacted, and 2034. So I'm quoting from their piece. So one of the opportunities we have in 2025, and it won't come again anytime soon after that, is an opportunity to invest in families, to have tax policy that's specifically directed at the middle class, at families, to help them, to give them relief. And if that means we take it from big corporations and billionaires, that's what we should do. And even doing that won't right the ship or balance what's happened over 40 years, but at least we'd have an opportunity to finally make investments in families instead of billionaires and big corporations.
What other measures can Congress pursue to prevent the sorts of inflationary spirals in the future?
Well, I think we have to make sure that in the future that these big multinational corporations that have engaged in this predatory greedflation and have pretty much gotten away with it because we don't have the law in place that provides a bulwark against that. If the Federal Trade Commission is given this authority and has the resources to be able to pursue very expensive litigation against big companies, and there's a level playing field, so the big corporations and their lawyers, they hire these law firms that have thousands of lawyers in them because they have all this money they can afford to spend on lawyers. But if they're on a somewhat level playing field with the Federal Trade Commission, and they have pressure brought to bear on them, maybe when they're thinking about jacking up prices next time, they'll be a little less reluctant to do it if they feel that a price gouging investigation will be commenced and they'll have to pay a stiff penalty. So I think that's part of what we have to do. We have to continue to make sure that consumers have the information that they need. I think a lot of consumers, even before I did my reports, had a sense of this. They certainly had a sense of shrinkflation. They keep seeing the contents of packages shrinking, but they may not have understood the broader context that this was happening on a nationwide scale. Corporate profits up 75%. I'm not sure we've ever seen that in a 2-year time period in American history. Corporate profits exploding for the same companies that got a huge tax break just a couple of years earlier that was still in effect when their profits were going up. And those same companies were, having exploding profits and exploding prices. So I think giving consumers information is critically important. But tax policy helps to even up the playing field economically.
To preserve the sustainability of Social Security, what change should Congress prioritize, and what proposed change or changes should Congress reject or rule out?
Well, the first thing we have to do is to make sure that we don't enact into law what a lot of Republicans in Washington have been preaching for years. They have, if you look at their proposals over the last decade or a little more than a decade, and they haven't disavowed these, by the way. So these are still core tenets of their party. They've proposed privatizing Social Security, voucherizing Medicare, and decimating the Medicaid program through massive cuts, the likes of which we've never seen, tens of billions in a single year. So we have to stop them from doing that. So we need to have a debate about those efforts, because sometimes people forget that Republicans have been pursuing those policies a long time. I think as long as we can stave off or push back against those privatization schemes and those proposals that have been resurrected time and again, I think then we can have a conversation about coming together in a bipartisan fashion to make sure that we have a foundation for Social Security to be sustainable. But for those in Washington who are talking about reducing benefits or undermining that basic promise, this is an earned benefit. This isn't just something that fell from the sky. It's earned by workers. They pay into it. It's an earned benefit, and they should have the right to expect that we're going to come to a consensus to preserve Social Security. Now, this tax debate has a big impact on it. We cannot allow a tax bill to be in place or a tax policy to be in place where you blow a hole of $4.5 trillion in the federal and add to the federal debt by $4.5 trillion. That will be devastating for Social Security, for Medicare, for Medicaid, and for so many other priorities.
You touched on this a bit with what the American Rescue Plan did with the child tax credit. What role should the federal government have in improving access to affordable childcare?
Well, that's a great question, because I think it's an issue that the federal government, in a substantial way, really hasn't wrestled with, or had not wrestled with until 2021 and 2022. As you remember, we had a debate about new federal investment in a series of high priority areas. One of them was home and community-based services for seniors and people with disabilities. So you could receive skilled care at home or in the community, as opposed to just having one option, which is a nursing home. That was a major priority that we talked about at the time, and I was leading the effort on that. I was also directly involved in trying to urge members of the Senate to embrace new investments in quality affordable childcare, as well as pre-kindergarten education. And so I think the federal government can play a role here that is substantial. Obviously, everyone knows for schools at the elementary and secondary education level, most of the dollars for public education are provided by state and local governments. The federal government plays a limited role in that. But I think on the question of childcare, we have to do more than the existing programs in place. We have, for example, the block grants in place for childcare. We have other assistance for childcare. but you have an awful lot of Americans who are eligible on paper but never are enrolled because there's not enough funding for these families. So I'm taking you back again to one of your first questions. It gets back to the tax code. If we're going to make the kind of commitment that I believe we need to make in childcare and in investments in children more broadly, you've got to make those decisions, those hard decisions in the tax code. You can't give away the store to billionaires and invest in childcare. You can't have a corporate tax break that costs $2 trillion and expect to invest in children. So some of these basic decisions aren't just year-to-year budget or appropriations decisions. Sometimes that's kind of nibbling around the edges, even though I think the efforts undertaken by Senator Patty Murray and others in the Appropriations Committee have provided a lot more money for these programs. But to make a seismic difference in the lives of children, we have to make sure that we're using what I think is existing revenue in the tax code, as long as you have your priorities right, and you're not giving away the store to wealthy Americans and billionaires and big corporations, to invest in children. And one of the ways to invest in children so they learn more now and earn more later, and that's literally the truth. It's not just a rhyme. If they learn more when they're young, they're going to earn more, they're going to have a better job in the future. One of the ways to do that is to make sure that we have quality, affordable child care.
Should Congress increase the federal minimum wage? Why or why not?
Yes, they should, and it's long overdue to get at least to $15 an hour. That number hasn't increased, as you know, at the federal level since 2009, and to go this long, to go 15 years without an increase, is bad for workers. It's also really bad for children, because one of the best ways that you can change the life of a child is to make sure that the person that is taking care of that child, two parents, a mom or a dad or another caregiver or caretaker, that person who's taking care of that child has the resources to feed that child and to give that child a secure life. So raising the minimum wage is a huge investment, not just in that worker, in that family in the present. It's a huge investment in the future prospects for success of that child.
What's one change that the federal government could make to healthcare to improve access and affordability?
Well, there's no question that we have to continue to make sure that for example, in the context of the Affordable Care Act exchanges, some refer to it as Obamacare, but they're really the exchanges where people can go at the state level or in the federal exchanges to receive health care. And a lot of good deals there for families. But we've got to make sure that the subsidies that have been provided over time to offset some of the premium increases, that those subsidies remain in place. And down the road in the future, they'll have to be increased to keep up with to keep up with changes in the economy or changes in a family. So making sure that we're making those the exchanges through the Affordable Care Act affordable is critically important, and making sure that when it comes to employer sponsored coverage, that copays and deductibles are at a level that are affordable, because sometimes even if someone can afford a premium, sometimes that's the problem. But even if that's not the problem, the deductibles and the copays are high. So making sure that insurance companies are held in check. Now, a lot of that is done. The policing of that is done at the state level through the insurance departments. Pennsylvania has one of those, but I think the federal government can continue to play a role, especially with subsidies.
What are specific changes the U.S. should make to how refugees or immigrants seeking asylum are vetted?
Well, I think the bipartisan border security legislation that was just unfortunately voted down, mostly because Republicans voted it down in the Senate, and the same was true when we voted on it just, I guess about a month and a half or 2 months ago. That was a terrible loss, not just for the border specific policies as it relates to investing in the screening technology at the border, so that we can find fentanyl in vehicles because of that high kind of high tech equipment, the screening equipment. They call it so-called non-intrusive inspection equipment, so that you can find it. You can locate the fentanyl in vehicles, where most of the fentanyl is being transported through ports of entry in vehicles, and unfortunately by American citizens trying to smuggle it into the country and then make money. But the loss of that bill, or the defeat of that bill, because it didn't get 60 votes, meant that investment in that screening technology will not be nearly as robust as it could be to stop billions of doses at the border. Currently, we stop about 1.1 billion doses at the border, but that's not nearly enough. We need to be stopping multiple billions of doses of fentanyl. But in addition to that part of the bill, the other part of the bill that was important was the changes to asylum policy, which would greatly reduce the number of people crossing the border and claiming asylum. The president made a proposal just yesterday on that same level. Unfortunately, his proposal is likely to be challenged and litigated, and I don't know if the administration will prevail in court. So the best way to change asylum policy, the best way to secure the border, or at least begin to secure the border, is to pass this bipartisan legislation that the Border Patrol Union supported. And last time I checked, the Border Patrol Union hasn't endorsed any Democrats. So this is a conservative, the toughest and most important border security bill in 25 years.
One last question. Can you cite a policy or initiative President Trump pursued that you thought was worthwhile?
Yeah, actually a couple. I think when the president took a different approach to trade policy, I supported him when he did that. During the Trump administration, he appointed a trade representative who was someone who was Mr. Lighthizer, who was focused on making sure that if we're going to have a trade deal with another country, we're going to make sure that protections for our workers, for American workers, are not just a priority, but such a priority that it'll be in the base agreement. It won't be kind of a side agreement down the road at the end when they're wrapping things up. And that was very important. And also that later, because of good Democratic work and advocacy by leaders like then Speaker Pelosi and Chairman of the Finance Committee Ron Wyden and Senator Brown and others, and I was part of this effort as well, to make sure that when the final deal with Canada and Mexico came together, so-called USMCA, that we not only had those worker protections to level the playing field, so these countries are treating their workers the right way, so that we're not at a competitive disadvantage with our workers, and forcing Mexico to agree to some tough worker provisions, but also to make sure that there are environmental protections and other protections for our workers and our companies. So I think the Trump administration was pursuing some good work there. Also on some of the tariff work the president, his administration engaged in, and then President Biden has either ratified or amplified and increased the 301 tariffs that push back against China's predatory economic behavior, to make sure that especially our steel companies can compete on a level playing field when China floods the market to try to drive down their price and get an advantage in the marketplace, to the detriment of our steel companies and our steel workers. Same is true with aluminum. So on a number of fronts, I could point to that we were working on some of the same economic policies.
Thank you for joining us today, Senator Casey. Our communities greatly appreciate your time. And
Michael, thank you
day.
for the time. Same to you. Thanks.